With the contact phase of the operation within the scope of this larger nationwide invasion occurring in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma at 12:30 or 30 minutes after the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes and booting on of electronic warfare assets, 3 different maneuver battalions belonging to the 17th PLA Combined Arms Brigade, belonging itself to the 58th PLA Group Army as a whole, had been tasked with seizing control of the southwestern portion of the city, and primarily within it, the OG&E Frontier Power Plant, a facility which was unable to be properly secured by elements of the 2nd of the 134th, as this battalion was originally tasked with providing security as a boost of security to the power plant here for sure, and possibly even to the OG&E Mustang plant as well, although the details on the latter were being smoothed out before the invasion had kicked off, and it kicked off suddenly, giving this battalion no chance whatsoever at all to be deployed to its original intended location from the hotels and parking lots where their vehicles and themselves were posted temporarily within the entertainment district, as those facilities had been rented out for their use. As the artillery started the contact phase of the operation in the OKC Battle space or area of operations of the 58th PLA Group Army at 12:30, in this particular area, the 40 PLZ-05 howitzers comprising the firing companies, or the firing batteries rather, of the artillery battalion had opened fire on what originally had been, at first, a group of materializing 700 reactionary armed civilians within this area, and had eliminated half of their number while driving the other half into the area of the OG&E Frontier Power Plant, mostly because of the artillery forcing them away, but also because many among that number that lived within the relative vicinity of the power plant knew for sure that the power plant itself was a relatively well-hardened structure and could possibly serve as a defensive hardpoint, as there were many former military personnel within the ranks of this outcropping of reactionary armed civilians that had ran away together from the heavy artillery barrage from DPICM rounds and HE rounds, and word of mouth quickly spread among those that were fleeing the area to head to the Frontier Power Plant, as many different people got the idea and shared it with others around them, which ended up causing a relatively large grouping of them that were already headed that way anyhow to veer and move towards the plant, while others were still relatively outside of the plant and would end up slowing down these maneuver forces even more, as en route to the plant, as they initiated from their jumping off points and embarked to the plant itself to capture it, they had been slowed down quite a bit by different bands of other reactionary armed civilians in groupings of 10 to 20, all in all spread out along their route, numbering in totality approximately several hundred, although these forces were tiny and tried to carry out ambushes that were easily brushed aside. These maneuver forces had to stop and engage each and every one of them, which took up time. And this had to be done to secure their supply routes of their own units into the area of the city, as these forces were seen as a possible threat to supply lines and therefore had to be engaged, as every time they were encountered attempting to put up an ambush and were usually spotted first by ISR assets, except for a few occasions where they hid within coniferous wooded areas along the routes where they were protected somewhat from infrared imaging. These forces were easily again brushed aside and destroyed, but they could have served as a potential threat to the supply lines and therefore had to be stopped and engaged repetitively, which held up this force on what should have been a 1-hour trip, moving slowly and steadily up to the OG&E Frontier Power Plant, which turned into a 2-hour trip, with them having had left at 12:30 and arriving at 2:30 just into the area before they had to fan out and fight even more reactionary armed civilians that had either not made it to the immediate vicinity of the plant or had stayed on the fringes to fight against the PLA forces now moving and beginning to now fan out and surround a relatively large area of this section of the city around the plant, as the different comprising companies of these 3 battalions now began doing so. As number in half the artillery of the original 700 number, there was now, by the time the forces had successfully closed their ring around the plant, there was now less than 300 within the cordon itself, with there being approximately 148 armed civilians outside of the plant campus and 123 that were actually within it at the time that this battle had officially kicked off. As they had even arrived in the area when it was 2:30, it took them more time yet still to close their ring, and by the time they started the battle over the plant itself at 4 a.m., they wouldn't clearing the actual plant complex for 15. And that was when they would actually get into the plant campus and begin to clear it. So this battle would roughly be a grand total of 45 minutes in total duration, because they had to clear the plant buildings themselves, which would take even more time than the fighting that was raging outside of the plant. The reactionary armed civilians were among the least wise of the armed civilian population, with many tens of thousands of armed civilians within the city having either literally and figuratively gone underground to hide, and others yet still having fled entirely to nature. And the reason why they were more wise was because this gave them the opportunity they needed to be able to regroup, get organized, delegate responsibilities, to where they could become an even more effective fighting element as a partisan/guerrilla/insurgent type element than they would have been had they done like the bold reactionary armed civilians did, who lacked neither the actionable intelligence on their enemy to know even how to fight against them, and lacked the heavy weaponry at this point in the conflict to fight against them, as they would gather better weaponry over time, and this would take time, as it would require very strategic planning and thinking, and this is one thing that could not be done in a reactionary manner, as well as responsibilities being delegated and a training cadre to begin to train civilians that had no training to be proficient in combat skills. Hence the reason why reactionary armed civilians became slaughtered almost outright. Because again, they had no actionable intel, no intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, no communications other than word of mouth, line of sight, earshot distance, and they had no system. They had no system of organization, coordination, no training in most cases, minus the former military personnel and some that had basic marksmanship training that weren't former soldiers or Marines or airmen or whatever else, and others that had some prior experience in the security field, but most of them, for the most part, had no training, no experience, no anything to fall back on, and they lacked the proper weaponry to take on a force that had total ISR dominance, had total communication dominance, artificial intelligence dominance, and technology dominance overall, and heavier weaponry. And in this sense, numbers as well, as they had to take time for the non-reactionary armed civilians to organize themselves to be able to put up a long-term resistance. It was about continuity. It was not about what they could do at that particular second. Did they want to have an effective response? Or did they want to try and prove something right off the bat, which would end to total ruination, as they were not ready for the fight that they would be picking if they were choosing to do the latter and fight right offhand. They wanted continuity, and most of them were intelligent enough to understand this, that it would take time, it would take proper organization, coordination, and training to get themselves ready for a long-term fight with a very powerful enemy that had all of these advantages over them. Although one good thing did come out of all the handful of thousands of reactionary armed civilians at this particular battle, And it was that it bought time for the other tens of thousands of others to go into hiding or flee the area so that they could get better organized and prepared for the long-term fight, as it would be a very long fight indeed during the occupation of the country and their resistance against it. And they needed all the time they could get. As these forces had closed the ring, we go now to the battle map itself. At this particular battle, only one small subsection of the total surrounded area, which was many miles wide and also many miles in depth from north to south. It was quite wide from east to west, approximately 4 total miles, and from north to south, it was about 2 miles. This particular map is only a 1 mile by 1.5 mile map segment of the larger battle, with much of the fighting by this point of this showing of this map having had concluded already on the outskirts as the ring had closed around the plant, and many of the neighborhoods that were immediately within its vicinity, including, being that this was a semi-rural / suburban area, some of the properties included farms and ranch properties, while others included more suburban type housing, albeit in a rural-like setting or quasi-rural setting, as these were relatively large homes of the suburban style, but were along the same road the power plant was on, which was a quasi-rural area, although there were also housing developments that were whole developments, but those were elsewhere outside of this immediate vicinity. To the north there lay a trailer park, and to the west there lay 2 ranch properties, large ranch properties, and to the south there were wooded areas with some roads that offshot into some other semi-rural areas with other ranch and country properties. Although this was considered a part of the city, as it was an outer suburb of it, this area that this plant lay in was again semi-rural and suburban, as it had housing developments more to the north and to the southeast and to the east, while between this portion of the suburban area and the highway, it was more semi-rural, although there were a few housing developments to the west as well, and some commercial properties closer to the highway. Now, within this area here, the power plant's main buildings lay right here, and the office and administrative areas are within this portion of the plant, with 2 guard shacks at the gate, the main gate, with a large drainage ditch running around the perimeter of the plant that ran past this trailer park and also forked off running further north from here behind this ranch property here, while it also veered to the south and west past this ranch property bordering it. Although this fenced-in area was just a part of the ranch, it technically was a larger property, as was this one. The forces attacking were mechanized infantry, led by their platoons VN-20 infantry fighting vehicles, which were cutting-edge, state-of-the-art, state-of-the-industry infantry fighting vehicles, brand new. Even though the ZBDO-4A was an outstanding and highly advanced infantry fighting vehicle, these were even a step up from those. These were brand new. And they boasted the same weapons and a lot of the same technology, like laser and IR scrambling capabilities, which was very effective at protecting the vehicle from laser range finding equipment, because the portable Chinese Z87 laser scrambling device that was portable and carried by troops, the one in the vehicle was even more capable than was that, as it was vehicle-based and protected the vehicle from laser rangefinders, and IR scrambling protected it from infrared imaging of any type, including any for weapons. And the Type 89A was an armor personnel carrier, but was a newer armor personnel carrier than the Type 63 was, and some of the others that China had, but this being a relatively strong, well-built armor personnel carrier and had a turret gunner and could carry a squad along with the gunner and driver. These forces, as well as the armored forces operating in the area, consisting of a tank company that had been sent in, these tanks being the Type 96B main battle tanks, which, although the Heavy Combined Arms Brigade, the 28th, possessed Type 99As, which were even a small step up from the Type 96B, the Type 96B was an incredibly very well built, very strong and capable and advanced main battle tank among the top two that China possessed, as China still operated multiple different tank designs, with the Type 88C, 96B, and 99A especially being the top three of their main battle tanks, with others following behind those, as those were the newer and more advanced models, the three mentioned. As one company had been sent into this particular area, it had broken up into its 4 comprising combat platoons, as well as its 5th platoon, its logistical and command platoon, being its headquarters platoon, having moved into the area with the first 2 platoons taking to the road and blocking the plant facing its main entrance on its eastern-facing side, while the other 2 tank platoons had rolled in from the slight southeast to use their thermal imaging systems to look through the homes and behind them to check for enemy activity. Finding none, the headquarters had moved in, while these 2 platoons had checked these areas and patrolled them behind and off the map before converging and moving a bit further to the north and off the map itself, leaving their other 2 platoons as their last platoons in their column sitting on this road. While there was also a mechanized infantry company from one of the 2 mechanized infantry battalions that's set up right here, with its headquarters platoon surrounded by one of its other platoons of its combat platoons, one of 3 surrounding it, enhancing the already formed star formation, as this part of the drainage ditch was relatively wide and 2 of the Shangji trucks had driven down a light dip and into the drainage ditch, along with one of the armor personnel carriers, the Type 89As, and one of the Tiger MRAPs of the headquarters platoon, while the other was up on the road, as the ditch wasn't as deep in this area or as steep or as narrow, and vehicles could get into it there, while the others faced the trailer park and immediately encountered contact with the enemy. And the VN-20 infantry fighting vehicle had totally laid waste to them with their 30mm autocannon, shredding through these trailers like a hot knife through butter and cutting up these forces with impacting HE, AP ammunition, and just shredded this entire group of trailers to pieces, as this was the fence around the property, and they're firing right through it and hitting these forces that started contact with them. While the other 2 platoons had spread out along the north of the power plant with their weapon systems staggered, some facing the trailer park and opening fire on it, while others faced the plant, as they provided a 360-degree oval of security around their forces. As initially they were taking fire from the drainage ditch, as Americans were running through the drainage ditch where it forked off here, where there was a short hill on top of the fork area. They were moving up the hill and through the north at the time, and some even into the trailer park at the time, where this JH-7, which was a ground attack aircraft and a very powerful one indeed, as it could carry almost completely 20,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions and even some air-to-air munitions for self-defense, although these had been used in their primary role as a ground attack aircraft and were loaded down with air-to-ground munitions, payloads, including cluster munitions and 2,000-pound air-to-ground munitions, which these aircraft, they could drop free-fall air-to-ground munitions or dumb bombs, and essentially they could also drop laser-guided or satellite-guided munitions, and they could fire air-to-ground missiles as well, as there were different types this aircraft could fire, and a few different types of air-to-air missiles, again, for self-defense in the air. These forces would be dropping a substantial payload on the armed American civilians operating through this area, as some of them would even be coming in their technicals, which normally, by definition, a technical would usually have some type of heavier weapon system in the bed, like a machine gun or a mortar mounted, or even sometimes a recoilless anti-tank gun or something of this effect, although the American armed civilians at this point had a very limited access to any types of heavy weapons so far in the invasion this early in. They did have men with rifles in the back, which technically counted of them being a technical when they used their pickup trucks in these ways, by carrying some of their dismounted forces into battle with their pickup truck, or having men with rifles fire up over the bed. As these forces would be brutally crushed by the air power, which these JH-7s, two of which were the last pair of JH-7s that hadn't dropped their air-to-ground munitions yet, having just gotten fuel before even the fuelers had turned around and headed back to Mexico to reload their fuel and refuel themselves for their next operations. As to keep aircraft continually flying, there had to be continual mid-air refueler flights this deep in the nation. And even these aircraft would have to turn back shortly due to fuel concerns, as they would have to do their RTB to Mexico and refuel in order and rearm for future missions into the country. And although this was the last pair of JH-7s out of the original squadron that hadn't as of yet dropped their first payloads, they had been diverted from the battle that occurred at the international airport by this time, as the forces at the international airport only used them in a strafing capacity, as the international airport was of vital importance for the future as it pertained to the occupation and colonization operations, as this was to become the local megafob hosting coalition forces, primarily Chinese forces. And these forces had not dropped their payloads on the airport property, as they did not want to severely damage the terminal buildings, as they were seen as too important for using heavy weapons upon, even artillery direct strikes as well. So these aircraft were instead diverted to assist in the combat operations unfolding in the battle occurring at the OG&E Frontier Power Plant, dropping heavy payloads on a grouping of armed reactionary American civilians as they clustered together from being more widely dispersed, as they now channeled in towards the power plant and a few other different areas. As they became more bunched up and closer together, as most of them were making for the plant facility, trying to get through its fencing to get in, which now had a tear in it. Others had been heading into the trailer park, and others yet still trying to head directly north and adjacent or in the drainage ditch for more protection from ground-based fire, although from the air, this made little difference, as the dropping of two large cluster munitions and two 2,000-pound munitions each on this group here, and this wide group right here would end in great disaster. As this was happening, these forces again had been firing at this lead VN-20 infantry fighting vehicle, which had been returning fire as it moved into place, as this column was now slowly moving up here behind it, with this aircraft coming in and strafing with its twin 23mm autocannons, or its nose cannons, as it had a 23mm nose cannon, well, a twin 23mm nose cannon, instead of a 30mm nose cannon like the fighter aircraft like the J-11 possessed. Although this wasn't quite as large of a caliber, the fact that it was a twin cannon and it was a 23mm can fire still armor-piercing HE ammunition made it still extremely devastating to ground vehicles, even the most heavily armored of them, because it could tear through the roofs of most of these armored vehicles with ease and destroy them. As this was occurring, as the strafing happened and they were firing at forces just off the map that were running into the area with their strafing attack here, they dropped two laser-guided precision munitions while they dropped their two cluster munitions, which were free-fall cluster munitions, as they began to pull up from their attack, which broke open, the canisters broke open, releasing the mini munitions, the bomblets, all over this field right here, which was on a slight gentle rolling hill above this part of the drainage ditch, while the laser-guided precision munitions landed here, while these forces were already being engaged by forces on the ground from the fire coming from this VN-20 into this area here, and as the main weapons scanned their sectors, they fired into all these forces, while the troops had broken off the rolling shield formation double column that they had pulled behind this vehicle, taking fire from over here at the plant, to move up and beside the vehicle first before then moving just a little bit further, even before these munitions began to impact all over the area. Now, because most of these reactionary armed civilians lacked any sort of night vision capabilities, not all, but most, while the fire was coming in from these forces moving in, including from the vehicle, and also from the forces that had by this point been clearing this house, 2 squads that were dismounted from this same platoon that was leading this attack into this area here, these 2 squads in the single column and the wedge right here had broken into this home on this ranch property and cleared it before having moved out. One squad going out the front door and to the left of the over here, while the second squad moved to the barn along with the squad that was waiting outside to see if anybody ran out the back, before moving up with this squad and breaking into the barn, with both each now bounding and covering tactically along with this squad adjacent to the fence, coordinating their actions over the radio and their squad leaders' handheld combat data links. And as they advanced, although they were taking fire, which is what this green indicates, none of them were hit because, again, they lacked really any real serious night vision capabilities, and all they could really do is return fire at the tracers they could see flying at them. And although many of them were being hit already at this point, as indicated by the green surrounded in red, which are KIAs of these forces that are being hit before these munitions even saturate this area, as indicated by the arrows as the general movement of the ground forces, and these 2 arrows of each of these pickups that are surrounded by red, which indicates these were completely destroyed in the munition shower that basically rained down. These forces that had been in this trench at the time that were moving up out of here were eventually all KIA'd too by the scanning heavy machine gunner on this turret right here firing at them, as well as mortars landing in this area that had already wiped some of these guys out right off the bat at the opening of this map. Same with this strike right here, getting a few of them in the ditch with their heads exposed right above the ditch. And munition strikes here from the heavy 120 millimeter assault gun / mortar systems, the PLL-05s, that each of the fire support companies of each of the 2 attacking mechanized infantry battalions, as this company of mechanized infantry came from one of the 2 mechanized infantry companies, this one came from the other, and this armored company was committed from the armored battalion, this tank company from the armored battalion. So each of the 3 battalions committed one of its comprising companies, as each was comprised of 8 companies, the mechanized infantry battalions and the armored battalion, and each sent a representative of their battalion, a representative company, to storm and capture the plant and secure it, while the others had cordoned and already battled with American forces on the perimeter before they had closed their pincers around the area. And these forces, their fire support company, of both mechanized infantry battalions, as each had one, had a platoon of PLL-05 heavy assault gun mortars and 2 platoons of the Type-63 multiple launch rocket systems, which were light artillery rocket systems that were shorter range, only 5-mile range. And they were easy and quick to reload, which is why they were so popular, and they were still relatively destructive, especially against light-skinned vehicles and dismounted infantry forces, while the 120 millimeter assault gun mortar was a menace to buildings and even many different vehicle types and personnel. Although these buildings were generally off limits to heavy artillery and air power, they did take a little bit of damage on the walls, at least, very minimal damage from the assault gun mortars that landed nearby to hit some of these forces, as well as the rocket strikes that literally flew just over these buildings before crashing into the area right here. All of this was ISR directed, as always. So these are precision strikes done by these weapon systems. Even the calculations for the launching of the rockets was precise so that the rockets didn't slam directly into these buildings but landed just outside of them, eliminating enemy personnel that were spotted running through this large yard area of the power plant between the administrative buildings and the plant buildings proper. Now, these strikes were devastating. By the front gate, tank shells had destroyed these two guardhouses that controlled the gate and KIA'd these personnel. These were gate guards of the plant. There were 7 of them total here, and they were all KIA'd, these 3 and these 4, as the tank shells impacted and blasted the gate guardhouses. And mortars had struck and eliminated these 4 hiding amid parked vehicles in the parking lot. And also the same occurred with these personnel out here. There were 7 personnel total here. 2 here, 1 here, 1 here, 1 here, 1 here, 1 here. They were all KIA'd by a mortar strike and heavy machine gun fire from the tops of the turrets of these tanks, and coax machine gun fire that was totally raking this particular area of the parking lot, shredding through vehicles and smacking into these buildings. These forces here were cut down as well, as a frag T shell had been fired in this little courtyard area and blasted and cut them down completely. These forces would be wiped out by attack from the soon-to-be dismounted mechanized infantry forces, as well as fire from heavy machine guns of these vehicles by the time they would get here. But first, this company had been split up into its 3 comprising combat platoons, leaving its headquarters platoon, the command and logistical elements, off-map and behind this platoon in the middle, with this one having earlier had peeled off to clear, sending 3 of its already dismounted squads to clear the ranch property, the buildings, as well as the last 2 squads by the VN-20 and this first Type 89A behind it, to now advance up and help their other squads lay down good fire on these forces, especially those now moving into the area from further off the map that were not destroyed by all of these munitions impacting the area here, because this whole area was hit by cluster munitions, which wiped out a few of the guys on the end here and got the pickup truck as it got here. These had smashed through this fence here. This one was intending to smash through the fence, but got blasted before it even had a chance to do so. With a few more armed American civilians moving into the area, they continued to engage in a firefight with this lead vehicle and these guys before these guys finally cut them all down. While this other squad had since moved into this drainage ditch and was engaging these forces that were between the building that did not get destroyed by the 120mm mortar strikes or the 130mm light artillery rocket strikes landing right here that had cut down all these guys. Now, the aircraft contributed decisively, not just with the strafing and the regular 2,000-pound munitions they dropped, but also with the cluster munitions just devastating a large area here. And by the time this aircraft got here, after strafing some of these guys right offhand, as it veered and dropped its payloads, 2 of its laser-guided 2,000-pound munitions and its cluster munitions, all of these guys were decimated in this drainage ditch. The guys that were running up into this area here were gone, as well as all those getting up onto this hill and all those running through this ditch. All the munitions got into the ditch and also on this hill and landed right all along this general area, and even got a lot of the guys trying to get into the trailer park, with the rest having been picked off by machine gun fire, just raking the area by this vehicle scanning its sector of fire. As they all had quadcopter ISR assets that could see all of this going on, and as soon as they were notified of the aircraft coming, they pulled them away and just let the aircraft go to town on these forces down here, so that they wouldn't lose their quadcopters. And this platoon here of this company, this platoon already holding up the center, now running over this very low laying part of the ditch that wasn't too steep on either end and was relatively wide so the vehicles wouldn't get stuck when crossing it. they ran up through the ditch and smashed through the fencing, and by the time they got here, this platoon was moving along the area here with these two squads that were in wedge formations on the very end that had been dismounted from these two vehicles, the last one and this middle one, breaking off to clear the flanks while the other forces were to further ahead break through the fencing and get to start clearing the property in conjunction with the forces that now had smashed their way in and were moving up before dismounting all 5 of their squads, as this platoon had not dismounted any squads yet, as this one had all its forces here, this one had his forces alongside of it in rolling shield, double column formation, and wedge formations. As these were different roads that led to different properties throughout this semi-rural area, this platoon had crossed a little further back where the ditch was more wide and less deep, so it wouldn't get stuck, sort of like what happened right here, whereas this little part here got more narrow as it got close to as it abutted the fences right here, got up to the fencing, it got very narrow, so they just basically further back had crossed and were now turning on this along this road right here as they moved into the area. Now, there are a lot of different wooded areas in this vicinity here as well, and including on these ranch properties, tiny strips of woods on these little hills, these very low-level hills, and between the trailer park fencing and the plant. And down in the southern part of the map itself, these areas here went off map where there was more wooded areas yet still between these roads here, these offshoots of roads that went from the main road here to different rural properties that were off map and to the south. Now, as these squads peeled off this platoon's rolling column of vehicles, they went to clear the flanks and were unaware for the moment that there were armed American civilians hiding within this coniferous pine-wooded area, which, due to the brilliant idea of one of the men here, he was aware that the pines could obscure and possibly even block out the ISR asset with their IR image from seeing them if they stayed still enough, which they did. And originally they had done so to hide and wait for the Chinese to pass the area. Although with the Chinese troops of these two squads, one going this way along the road and the other going this way towards this wooded area, with them now approaching, they didn't want to be either KIA'd by being spotted first or possibly captured in some kind of strange way. So they took their chance and decided to ambush these forces. When contact broke out, though they didn't really have very good night vision, minus one guy that had a pair and told the rest that they were coming, while they opened fire, they managed to wound one of the Chinese troops as they were kind of firing wildly, sort of like what happened up here with these guys. They wounded one of the troops of the Chinese while they returned fire and greased all these guys outright. They fired a 35mm tube-fired grenade from beneath one of the QBZ-95 rifles into here, as one of the soldiers of the squad had one. They fired an RPG anti-personnel round into this wooded area, and they fired their QJB-201 light machine gun and their QBZ-95 rifles into this area until there was no more return fire. As that was going on, they did what was intended and cleared the direct flanks of their vehicle column, while the other squads, the 3 remaining that were in the rolling shield double column formations, had peeled off their vehicles, going between them and into this ditch, 2 squads, while the lead squad, rolling adjacent to the VN-20 infantry fighting vehicle, had itself peeled off and made for this building right here as they all stopped within the fence after they smashed their way in, after these forces had long since been KIA'd right here and right here. As they all stopped together, what they were waiting on was, after these squads had dismounted, for these vehicles to roll on a bit further to cover them while they were right here as they faced these buildings. And this squad and this squad tactically bounded and covered, with this squad leading, laying down and watching their sector diagonally, with this squad bounding a little bit further ahead, laying down, watching the area, with this squad then bounding a little further ahead, laying down, watching the area, with this one bounding a little further ahead yet still watching the area, before this squad peeled around their vehicle right here, essentially watched around this way, while this other squad eventually then bounded while this squad watched over them with the vehicles and began to raid this building, with this squad peeling around the building to go for this main building that had personnel inside of it, which already, by the way, had been shelled by a few tank shells, as a little bit of fire had come from them at some of these vehicles as they rolled by across this parking lot through out of an upper floor window where they could see. And they began to raid this building, with this squad taking this building here. And the other squad here had bounded and taken this building, with this squad on the very end taking this building, and both began to clear these buildings rapidly as nobody was in these two, before one squad had gone around to enter this building and the other entered this building as well, of these two, with this squad that originally cleared this building going to clear this one. As these two entered, the building had already been cleared by this squad, as they kept in steady radio communication, but they held this building, so they kept one squad in there. Or they kept two squads in there after this one squad went to clear this building. That's why they both went in here to hold the building. So by that time, these three squads were clearing this large building of the plant proper, and although the plant had taken some minor damage on the outside, which really didn't translate to much of any real damage against the plant, as heavy artillery and direct airstrikes were off limits on the plant buildings proper themselves, these squads now clearing these buildings prepared to bound across to clear the other main plant building, which had about 20 armed American civilians within it, as all of these other ones had been KIA'd by this point from all of the munitions dropped out, the rest being cut down by heavy machine gun fire and ISR-directed other fire, such as from the VN-20 firing its 100mm main gun and 30mm autocannon with blasting ammunition at this area, and coax machine guns and more, with the ground troops dismounts from this drainage ditch also having fired at any troops that made it across. Now that that was going on, these troops over here that had been hiding in this wooded area, upon the firefight having broken out over here, as so many different things, of course, as always are occurring at about the same time or near the same time, these forces were about to be hit by the last two loitering munitions fired from an original volley of 48 that had already hit armed American civilian targets outside around the perimeter area as the forces were fighting their way around to surround this larger area. And these were the last two remaining that were hovering over the area. And as they were running out of fuel and loiter time, and they spotted these targets emerging from the woods to fire and try and snipe at these turret gunners, they came in for the kill and wiped out these two groups, while the turret gunners responded against this single man over here and wiped him out with machine gun fire. By the time this battle had concluded, the plant was completely captured after the troops went through every open floor plan area, every office, every generator room, every turbine room, every closet, every area of this structure had been thoroughly and methodically cleared of enemy forces, with some heated firefights occurring within this building itself on different floors, although it was finally totally cleared by 4:45 a.m. With the capture of this building and the destruction of all of the surrounding American forces in the trailer park to the direct south of this structure and to the northwest of it, with airstrikes that were very potent and destructive, rocket strikes, our infantry fighting vehicles, and armored carriers and dismounted forces the plant was finally secured, and additional troops of the 3 attacking battalions, some of which now were tasked with a new target as an outcropping of fresh reactionary armed civilians appearing by the lake that was just slightly to the north of I-44, had to be dealt with, sending a battalion of mechanized infantry there to swiftly deal with them, as there were only about 200 of them popping up at the time. With this battle having had concluded and the Mustang plant having already been captured, the sewage and water treatment plant was in the process of being captured when this battle also came to an end, with this ending literally minutes after. With the major fighting now essentially remaining being that occurring in the downtown, the fighting that was to occur against the last major American military unit on the map, and the fighting against the remains of the 2nd of the 134th that actually ended just minutes before 6 a.m., the 1st of the 180th Cav Squadron would be attacked after the battle here had concluded, which will be gone over next, as this battle concludes at almost the exact same time that the OG&E plant had been captured at 4:45 a.m., with this battle concluding at 5 a.m., with this battle beginning at 5 a.m., and with the battle in the downtown area raging on well into day 1 of the invasion itself. More to come in the next video.